Picture this. You're a young shepherd boy in 1947, just minding your own business, throwing rocks at your lost goats near some scary-looking caves. You toss a stone into one of those dark holes, and instead of hearing it hit the ground, you hear something break. Something that sounds like pottery? That boy had no idea he just made the most important discovery in human history. What he found hiding in those caves would shake the world of religion, history, and science forever. We're talking about secrets that were buried for over 2,000 years. Secrets that powerful people tried to hide. Secrets that could change everything you thought you knew about ancient history. Today, we're diving deep into the most mysterious and controversial discovery ever made. The Dead Sea Scrolls aren't just old pieces of paper. They're a time machine that takes us back to a world we never knew existed. And trust me, what these scrolls reveal will blow your mind. Let's go back to that shepherd boy, Muhammad Dib. He's just a regular kid living near the Dead Sea, which, by the way, is this super salty lake where nothing can live. That's why they call it dead. But on this day, this place was about to become the most alive archaeological site on Earth. So Muhammad throws his rock, hears the pottery break, and thinks, hey, maybe there's treasure in there. Like any curious kid would do, he climbs into the cave. But instead of gold or jewels, he finds these weird jars filled with old, rolled-up leather and papyrus. To him, they just looked like really old garbage. But here's where it gets crazy. Muhammad takes these worthless scrolls to a local dealer. The dealer doesn't know what they are either, but something feels special about them. Word spreads, and eventually, these scrolls end up in the hands of scholars who almost faint when they realize what they're looking at. These weren't just any old documents. These were manuscripts that were older than anything anyone had ever found. We're talking about texts that were written before Jesus was even born. Imagine finding your great-great-great-grandmother's diary, except multiply that by about 100 generations. The scholars couldn't believe their eyes. Here were copies of books from the Bible that were over 1,000 years older than any Bible manuscripts they'd ever seen. It was like finding the original recipe for Coca-Cola, but for religion and history. But that first cave was just the beginning. Over the next few years, archaeologists found 10 more caves in the same area. Each cave was like opening a treasure chest filled with ancient secrets. By the time they were done, they had found over 900 different manuscripts and thousands of fragments. Think about it this way. Imagine if you buried your diary in your backyard, and 2,000 years later, some kid finds it and suddenly knows everything about your life, your thoughts, your world. That's exactly what happened here. Except these weren't just personal diaries. These were the most important religious and historical documents of their time. The place where all this happened is called Qumran, and it's in the middle of nowhere. It's hot, it's dry, and it's basically a desert. But those harsh conditions are exactly what kept these scrolls preserved for so long. It's like nature created the perfect time capsule. What makes this discovery even more amazing is that most ancient documents from this time period have been lost forever. Wood rots, paper crumbles, and most organic materials just disappear. But the Dead Sea area is so dry and salty that it basically mummified these scrolls, keeping them frozen in time. The scrolls were written in 3 different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. This tells us that the people who wrote them were educated and lived in a multicultural world. They weren't just simple desert dwellers, they were sophisticated people with complex ideas about life, religion, and the future. But here's what really gets interesting. As scholars started reading these scrolls, they realized they weren't just finding copies of books they already knew about. They were discovering completely new texts, new stories, new ideas that had been lost to history for 2 millennia. Some of these scrolls contained prophecies about the end of the world. Others had detailed rules about how to live a perfect life. Some told stories about battles between good and evil that sounded like something out of a fantasy movie. And some contained secrets about religious practices that nobody knew existed. The people who wrote these scrolls called themselves the community, or the Sons of Light. They believed they were living in the last days before God would judge the world. They thought they were the chosen ones who would survive the coming apocalypse and inherit a perfect world. These weren't just random people writing random things. This was an organized community with strict rules, shared beliefs, and a clear mission. They were preparing for the end of the world, and they wanted to make sure their knowledge would survive even if they didn't. What did they believe was coming? A great war between the forces of light and darkness. They thought this war would last for decades and would end with God's people winning and ruling over a new perfect earth. Sound familiar? These ideas would later influence Christianity, Judaism, and even Islam. Drop a comment below and let me know. If you found ancient scrolls in a cave, what would you want them to say? What secrets from the past would blow your mind the most? Now that we know how these scrolls were found, let's talk about the people who actually wrote them. And trust me, these weren't ordinary folks. They were like an ancient secret society with beliefs and practices that would make your head spin. Most scholars believe the scrolls were written by a group called the Essenes. Think of them as the ultimate religious rebels of their time. While most Jewish people were living normal lives in cities and towns, the Essenes said, "Nope, we're out of here," and moved to the middle of the desert. Why did they leave? They thought the religious leaders in Jerusalem were corrupt. They believed the priests in the temple were doing everything wrong and that God was angry about it. So they decided to create their own perfect community where they could worship God the right way. But this wasn't just a simple commune. The Essenes had rules for everything, and I mean everything. They had rules about when to wake up, what to eat, how to pray, when to go to the bathroom, and even how to sneeze properly. They were like the ultimate perfectionists. To join this community, you couldn't just show up and say, "Hey, can I hang out?" You had to go through a 3-year initiation process. First, you'd spend a year as an outsider, learning their ways but not being allowed to participate in their meals or ceremonies. Then you'd spend 2 more years as a probationary member, slowly earning their trust. If you made it through all 3 years, you had to take an oath so serious that breaking it meant you'd be kicked out forever. And being kicked out wasn't just embarrassing. It was basically a death sentence because you weren't allowed to eat food prepared by non-Essenes, and no other community would take you in. These people were serious about purity. They believed that everything in the world was either perfectly clean or contaminated. There was no in-between. They took ritual baths multiple times every day. They wouldn't eat food that had been touched by outsiders. They even had special toilets built far away from their living areas because they thought human waste could spiritually contaminate their holy space. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Essenes believed they were living in the end times. They thought the world was about to end, and they were preparing for a cosmic battle between good and evil. They called this battle the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. In their minds, this wasn't just a regular war with swords and shields. This was going to be a supernatural battle involving angels, demons, and God himself. They believed that after 40 years of fighting, God would intervene and destroy all evil forever. Then the Essenes and other righteous people would rule over a perfect world for eternity. To prepare for this war, they studied prophecies obsessively. They had scrolls that predicted exactly when this battle would begin, who would fight in it, and how it would end. They even had detailed battle plans describing military formations and strategies that the Sons of Light would use to defeat the Sons of Darkness. The Essenes also believed in predestination, which means they thought God had already decided who would be saved and who would be damned before they were even born. You couldn't earn your way into heaven through good works. You were either chosen by God or you weren't. This idea would later become super important in Christianity. But they weren't just sitting around waiting for the end of the world. They were incredibly productive. They copied and studied religious texts, they developed new interpretations of biblical prophecies, and they wrote their own books about theology and philosophy. Some of the smartest religious thinkers in history came from this community. One of their most famous leaders was called the Teacher of Righteousness. We don't know his real name, but he was apparently a brilliant teacher who received direct revelations from God. The Essenes believed he was a prophet who could interpret hidden meanings in the Bible that nobody else could understand. This teacher of righteousness had an enemy called the wicked priest. Most scholars think this was probably the high priest in Jerusalem who persecuted the Essenes and maybe even killed their teacher. The scrolls describe this conflict in dramatic terms, like a cosmic battle between good and evil. The Essenes also had some pretty radical ideas about wealth and property. When you joined their community, you had to give up everything you owned. All property was shared communally. Nobody had personal possessions. They ate together, worked together, prayed together, and shared everything equally. This might sound like modern communism, but it was actually based on their religious beliefs. They thought that private property led to greed, jealousy, and conflict. By sharing everything, they believed they could create a perfect society without crime, poverty, or inequality. Women could join the Essene community, but they had to follow even stricter rules than men. Some Essene groups didn't allow marriage at all, believing that celibacy was necessary for spiritual purity. Other groups allowed marriage but had complex rules about when couples could be intimate. Children born into Essene families were raised by the entire community, not just their parents. They were taught to read and write at a very young age and were given intensive religious education. By the time they were teenagers, they knew more about theology and biblical interpretation than most adult priests in Jerusalem. What's your take on this? Could you live in a community where everything was shared and everyone had to follow the same strict rules? Let me know in the comments what you think about the Essenes lifestyle. Hold on to your hats, because this is where things get absolutely mind-blowing. The Dead Sea Scrolls didn't just confirm what we already knew about ancient history. They revealed secrets that completely changed how we understand the origins of Christianity, Judaism, and the Bible itself. Let's start with the biggest bombshell. For almost 2,000 years, scholars thought the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible dated back to around 900 AD. But the Dead Sea Scrolls contained biblical texts that were over 1,000 years older than that. Suddenly, we could see what the Bible looked like before centuries of copying and recopying by scribes. Here's what shocked everyone. The biblical texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls were almost identical to the Bibles we have today. We're talking about 95% accuracy across more than 1,000 years of hand copying. This proved that ancient scribes were incredibly careful about preserving these sacred texts exactly as they received them. But that 5% difference? That's where things get really interesting. Some of the Dead Sea Scroll versions of biblical books contain passages that aren't in our modern Bibles. Other passages are worded differently. Some stories have extra details that were lost over time. It's like finding the director's cut of your favorite movie with scenes you've never seen before. One of the most controversial discoveries was a scroll containing a different version of the Book of Samuel. This version includes a whole section about the prophet Samuel that's completely missing from our modern Bibles. It tells stories about Samuel's childhood and his relationship with God that we never knew existed. Even more shocking, some Dead Sea Scrolls contain books that didn't make it into the Bible at all. There's the Book of Enoch, which tells wild stories about fallen angels who came to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge. There's the Book of Jubilees, which retells biblical stories with extra details and different chronology. These books were apparently considered sacred by the Essenes, even though later religious authorities decided to leave them out of the official Bible. But here's where it gets really controversial. Some of the ideas in the Dead Sea Scrolls sound remarkably similar to things that Jesus would later teach. The Essenes talked about a coming Messiah who would be both a king and a priest. They believed in salvation through faith, not just following religious laws. They practiced baptism as a ritual of spiritual cleansing. They shared meals as sacred ceremonies. The Essenes even had a leader they called the Teacher of Righteousness, who was persecuted by religious authorities and possibly killed for his teachings. Does any of this sound familiar? Some scholars have suggested that Jesus either was an Essene or was heavily influenced by Essene teachings. Now, before you freak out, this doesn't mean Jesus wasn't unique or that Christianity is just recycled Essene theology. But it does show us that many of the ideas we think of as distinctly Christian were actually floating around in Jewish communities before Jesus was born. It's like discovering that your favorite song was actually based on an older melody that most people had forgotten about. One scroll that really blew everyone's minds was the Messianic Apocalypse. This text describes a coming Messiah who will heal the sick, raise the dead, and preach good news to the poor. Sound familiar? These are almost exactly the same things that the New Testament says Jesus did. But this scroll was written at least 100 years before Jesus was born. Another shocking revelation comes from scrolls describing Essene beliefs about life after death. Traditional Judaism during this time period didn't have clear teachings about heaven, hell, or resurrection. Most Jews believed that when you died, that was it. You went to a shadowy underworld called Sheol where everyone existed as weak ghosts. But the Essenes believed something completely different. They taught that righteous people would be resurrected with new, perfect bodies and would live forever in paradise. Evil people would be punished eternally in a place of fire and torment. Again, these ideas sound remarkably similar to later Christian teachings about heaven and hell. The Dead Sea Scrolls also revealed that the Essenes had developed sophisticated theories about predestination and divine grace. They believed that God had chosen certain people for salvation before the world was even created. Humans couldn't earn their way to heaven through good works alone. They needed God's grace to be saved. These ideas were revolutionary for their time. Most ancient religions taught that you could earn favor with the gods through sacrifices, rituals, and good behavior. But the Essenes taught that salvation was ultimately a gift from God that you couldn't earn, only receive. This concept would later become central to Christian theology, especially in the teachings of the Apostle Paul. One of the most mysterious scrolls is called the War Rule, or the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. This text reads like a combination of military manual and religious prophecy. It describes in incredible detail how the final battle between good and evil will be fought. According to this scroll, the war will last exactly 40 years and will be fought in specific stages. The Sons of Light, the righteous, will use particular weapons, formations, and strategies that are described down to the smallest detail. Even more interesting, the scroll describes supernatural beings, angels and demons, fighting alongside the human armies. What makes this really wild is that some of the military tactics described in the War Rule weren't used by armies until hundreds of years later. Some scholars think the Essenes might have had access to advanced military knowledge, while others believe these were prophetic visions of future warfare. The Dead Sea Scrolls also contained calendars that were completely different from the ones used by other Jews of that time. The Essenes used a 364-day solar calendar instead of the 354-day lunar calendar that was standard. This meant they celebrated all the holy days on different dates than everyone else. Why does this matter? Because it meant the Essenes were completely isolated from mainstream Jewish religious life. They couldn't participate in temple ceremonies because they thought the priests were celebrating everything on the wrong days. This calendar difference was one of the main reasons they separated themselves from the rest of Jewish society. Have you ever wondered if there are other ancient texts out there waiting to be discovered? What other secrets do you think might be buried in caves or hidden in ancient libraries? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This is where our story takes a dark turn. Because for decades after their discovery, the Dead Sea Scrolls were kept secret from the public. And when I say secret, I mean locked away where only a tiny group of scholars could see them. This wasn't just academic gatekeeping. This was a full-blown cover-up that lasted for almost 50 years. Here's how it worked. After the scrolls were discovered, they were purchased by various institutions and governments. The problem was, many of these scrolls were in terrible condition. They were fragmented into thousands of pieces, like the world's most important jigsaw puzzle. Someone had to put them back together and figure out what they said. A small team of international scholars was assembled to work on this massive project. They called themselves the International Team, and they were given exclusive access to the unpublished scrolls. Here's the crazy part. This team had no deadline, no oversight, and no requirement to share their findings with anyone. So what did they do? They sat on them. 4 decades. While the world waited to learn what these incredible documents contained, this small group of scholars took their sweet time. Some of them spent their entire careers working on just a few scrolls. Others seemed more interested in protecting their academic reputations than in sharing world-changing discoveries. By the 1980s, people started getting angry. Journalists began investigating why these scrolls were still secret after 40 years. Religious leaders demanded to know what was being hidden. Conspiracy theories started flying about Catholic Church cover-ups, government secrets, and academic corruption. The most controversial figure in this whole mess was a scholar named John Allegro. He was part of the original international team, but he started making public statements that his colleagues didn't like. Allegro claimed that the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that Christianity was based on earlier mystery religions and that Jesus might not have been a historical figure at all. His fellow scholars were furious. They accused him of making wild claims and misinterpreting the evidence. But here's the thing. Allegro was one of the few team members who was actually publishing his findings and sharing them with the public. The others were keeping everything secret while they criticized him for speaking out. The secrecy got so bad that in 1985, a biblical archaeology review editor named Herschel Shanks launched a public campaign called Free the Scrolls. He argued that these discoveries belonged to all humanity, not just a small group of scholars. He published articles with headlines like The Scandal of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Academic Politics and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Things got even more dramatic when 2 scholars named Robert Eisenman and Michael Wise decided they'd had enough of waiting. They somehow got access to a complete photographic archive of all the unpublished scrolls and released them to the public without permission. It was like an academic version of WikiLeaks. The international team was furious, but the cat was out of the bag. Finally, after almost 50 years, anyone could read these ancient documents and draw their own conclusions about what they meant. So what were they trying to hide? Well, that depends on who you ask. Some people believe the scrolls contained information that would embarrass or undermine major religions. Others think the scholars were just protecting their academic territory and didn't want to be rushed into making mistakes. One theory that really got people excited was the idea that the Dead Sea Scrolls might mention Jesus directly. After all, if the Essenes were still active during Jesus' lifetime, maybe they wrote about him. Some fragments seem to contain references to a crucified Messiah, which would be incredible evidence for the historical Jesus. But when these fragments were finally studied properly, most scholars concluded that they were talking about someone else entirely. The crucified Messiah texts seem to be referring to events that happened before Jesus was born, not during his lifetime. Another controversial theory involved the mysterious teacher of righteousness. Some scholars suggested that this figure was actually Jesus in disguise, or that the stories about Jesus were based on earlier stories about the teacher of righteousness. This would mean that Jesus was either an Essene leader or a fictional character based on Essene traditions. Most mainstream scholars reject these theories, but they're still debated today. The problem is that we know very little about the teacher of righteousness beyond what the scrolls tell us, and those references are often vague and symbolic. One of the most intriguing mysteries involves a scroll called the Son of God text. This fragmentary document mentions someone who will be called the Son of God, and will be called the Son of the Most High. Christians were excited because these phrases appear in the New Testament in reference to Jesus. But when scholars studied the context, they realized this scroll might actually be talking about an evil ruler, not a Messiah. It's possible that the phrases Son of God and Son of the Most High were being used sarcastically to describe a tyrant who claimed divine authority. This would completely change how we understand these important religious titles. The Dead Sea Scrolls also revealed that there was much more diversity in ancient Judaism than anyone had realized. We tend to think of Judaism in Jesus' time as a unified religion with clear beliefs and practices. But the scrolls show us that different Jewish groups had dramatically different ideas about God, the Messiah, life after death, and how to interpret the Bible. This has huge implications for how we understand the origins of Christianity. Instead of emerging from a unified Jewish background, Christianity developed during a time when Judaism itself was incredibly diverse and full of competing ideas. Jesus and his followers were just one group among many who were developing new interpretations of ancient traditions. Some of the unpublished scrolls apparently contained astronomical and astrological texts that showed the Essenes had sophisticated knowledge about celestial movements and calendar calculations. This challenges the stereotype of ancient people as primitive and superstitious. The Essenes were actually quite scientific in their approach to understanding the natural world. There are still scrolls that haven't been fully published or studied. Some are in such poor condition that scholars are waiting for better technology to read them without damaging them further. Others are tied up in legal disputes between different institutions and governments. What's really exciting is that new technology is revealing text on scroll fragments that appeared blank to the naked eye. Infrared imaging, digital enhancement, and computer analysis are uncovering words and letters that have been invisible for decades. Who knows what other secrets are still waiting to be discovered in scrolls we thought we had already read completely? The biggest question that remains is whether there are more scroll caves out there waiting to be found. The area around Qumran is huge, and it's possible that other ancient communities hid their libraries in caves that haven't been discovered yet. Every few years, archaeologists find new caves with pottery and artifacts, though most don't contain scrolls. What do you think was really behind the decades of secrecy? Was it just academic politics, or was there something more sinister going on? And what other ancient secrets do you think might still be hidden out there? Let me know your theories in the comments. We've just taken an incredible journey through one of history's greatest mysteries. From a shepherd boy throwing rocks in 1947 to international conspiracies and cover-ups that lasted for decades, the Dead Sea Scrolls have given us an unprecedented window into the ancient world. These aren't just old documents sitting in museums. They're proof that our understanding of history, religion, and ancient civilizations is constantly evolving. Every scroll that gets translated, every fragment that gets pieced together, every new technology that reveals hidden text, it all adds to our knowledge of who we are and where we came from. The Dead Sea Scrolls have shown us that the ancient world was far more complex and sophisticated than we ever imagined. The Essenes weren't primitive desert dwellers. They were brilliant scholars, careful record keepers, and visionary thinkers who preserved knowledge that would have been lost forever without their dedication. But maybe the most important lesson from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how long people try to hide it. For 2,000 years, these scrolls waited in their caves. For 50 years, scholars tried to keep them secret. But eventually, the world got to see them, study them, and learn from them. What other secrets are still out there, buried in caves, hidden in ancient libraries, or waiting to be discovered by curious explorers? The Dead Sea Scrolls remind us that our planet is full of mysteries we haven't solved yet and stories we haven't heard yet. If this video blew your mind like it did mine, smash that like button and let me know in the comments what shocked you the most. Was it the mysterious Essenes and their end times beliefs? The decades-long cover-up by scholars? Or the way these ancient texts challenge everything we thought we knew about the origins of major religions? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell because we're always digging into history's greatest mysteries. Next week, we're exploring another incredible archaeological discovery that's been hidden from the public for way too long. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Share this video with anyone who loves ancient mysteries, religious history, or just incredible true stories. The Dead Sea Scrolls belong to all of humanity, and everyone deserves to know the amazing secrets they contain. Until next time, keep questioning everything and never stop exploring the mysteries of our incredible world. There's always more to discover, and the truth is usually far more fascinating than we ever imagined.